Hello my lovelies, welcome to my little cottage by the sea, the place where I love to stitch and craft my way to a vintage inspired and sustainable lifestyle. In this episode I'm going to be doing a beginner friendly pattern cutting tutorial for this blouse that I am wearing. I'm calling it the Pierrot blouse because I'm going full on clown core. I'm really in love with these Pierrot style collars that all the Pierrot clowns wore, especially ones from the 1930s and before. This tutorial is very much the type of thing that I do for my beautiful coven over on Patreon. So if you enjoy this tutorial and find it easy to follow, then do head over to Tara Stitch Coven on Patreon, because there are so many tutorials for making your own garments, all filmed in exactly this way, and lots of other treats and delights besides. I'll pop all the links in the show notes below, and without any further ado, let's head over to my pattern cutting table to go step by step how to pattern cut your very own simple blouse. To pattern cut the Pierrot blouse, I'm going to be using my bespoke midi blocks. These were pattern cut with my coven over on Patreon, and a midi block is a very popular block now, and it was in the 20s. So the midi block you'll recognise because it's got this dart shaping in the side seam, and it's a relatively plain, almost dartless block, so it gives you this nice sort of loose fitting size. So those were drafted from my fitted bodice blocks over on Patreon. If you don't have your own bespoke blocks, you can of course use any block that sort of looks like this, so a commercial pattern that looks like this. One that I have that I've used is the Merchant & Mills, the Canva set. I bought this many years ago, but as you can see from the line drawing on the back, it's got this side dart, it's got a relatively high-ish neck, and the one thing that I think is a little bit of an issue is that this has a yoke on the back, but all you need to do is pin those together and then draw around it. My block, and all blocks that I do, don't have any seam allowance. If you use a commercial pattern like this, and I think the Anthea blouse by Anna Allen Clothing is another pretty good one, and actually has a slightly higher neck, so it might be better. But if you have this hanging around in your stash, you can create a block out of this. Just remember there's seam allowance here and none there. Alongside that, I've got my sleeve block, and the sleeve head of this fits perfectly in the arm side, or the armhole of my block. Other equipment that you're going to need, pretty straightforward. I use a pattern master. You just need a ruler, accuracy is key. I've got my paper scissors, I've got my tracing wheel, and I normally pattern cut in a very sharp pencil, which I urge you to do because then you can rub things out. But just so that you can see everything as clearly as possible, I'm just using a black pen. I do all my pattern cutting on spot and cross paper, and the first thing that I do is I'm going to balance my blocks. So what that means is I'm going to draw around my blocks on my spot and cross paper, making sure that they're balanced. So you can either match up at the armhole, but because this has got a side seam dart, I'm going to align them along the bottom here. And a general rule I like to think about how I place my blocks on paper is what sews together goes together. So the side seams that will be sewn together should be placed together on the pattern cutting paper. I'm going to create the centre front here, and the idea is that you go as perfectly through the spots and crosses as you possibly can. And I've given myself a little bit of space here because we're going to do a button stand, so that's going to come out from the centre front, and I write as much information as I need to on my paper as I go. Then my block's going to go somewhere like this, so what I will do is I will draw a line across here as well. Then nice and simply just going to draw around my block like so, and just make sure that you mark in things like the apex of the dart. So this is the apex and these are the legs. Oops, actually try and draw on the paper. As you can see, I'm always going squee with. Any notches, your front balance notch, pop that in. And what I tend to do on my blocks is I write the neckline measurements in, which you can just see here, because we're going to need that when we do our lovely Pierrot collar. Then draw in your dart like thus, and that essentially is your front block drawn around. And then I'm going to draw around the back, and the back's lovely and simple because there's literally very, very little to do on there. So I'm going to just leave enough room so that I can do seam allowance, etc. And it's just the same thing. Draw in that centre back, align the block on there and draw around. Your blocks should look something like this, and I've also written that measurement there. And just so that you know, I'm working in centimetres, but the information, the instructions are perfectly doable in inches too. I like to keep my working drawing close by so I can keep referring to it. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to have a look at this button stand. I've decided to use self-cover buttons, not because I particularly enjoy doing them, but I always really enjoy the way that they look. And these are 11mm sets, which is a little bit smaller than I'd like to use. But for the purposes of working on this Pierrot blouse, you do really need to know your button measurement when you're doing your button stand. And I always find it really, really helpful to kind of mock up drawing on these buttons so you sort of know where they're going to go. So these are going to straddle, if you like, this centre front line. So your button stand needs to run alongside that. So you're creating a button stand here. Even though these buttons are 11mm, you don't want a button stand that's just 11mm. You want a little bit of room either side. To work this out, I just like to use my pattern master and just sit it on top. And I actually think that if I do my button stand 1.5 centimetres, I've got a few mil that side and a few mil the other side, and that will look like a nice neat button stand. I think if you end up having quite big button stands, say if I did that as 3 centimetres, you end up with lots of this fabric either side of your button, and that actually is not going to look terribly nice. The centre front line is going to hit slap bang in the middle of that 1.5, so I need to work out half of 1.5 to put this side and half to put that side, and that basically is 0.75. Now in pattern cutting you do work to the absolute fraction of the inch or to the millimetre. So just to make my life a little bit easier, 1, 2, 3, here, probably need my glasses for this bit, and here. And that's one of the reasons I really love these pattern masters as well, because you've got this 0 point here and you go up the numbers and up, so you can just sort of work out quite easily where the 0.8 is. And I'm going to mark that at a few points along the centre front here, and then I'm going to match up those dots. I'm going to join the dots, so to speak. So just pop your pattern master on there and do your line all the way down like so, and then up at the top, and do that for the line that is on the other side of your centre front line. I always do little checks as I go along, so I've taken one of the buttons off of here, and I'm just laying it on there. And take off a couple more and aim not to lose the backs, just to sort of see what that's looking like. It's looking fairly good, like that. So I'm happy with that. So now I can move on to the next step. Now that I've done the button stand, the next step is to do the button band that needs to come back on itself. So you don't just put seam allowance here and then hope for the best. You do need to create a stable button stand, and the easiest way to do that is to fold along this line, the button stand line, not the centre front, as neatly as possible. One of the things about using pen is I get pen all over my hands, so one hopes that's not going to be distracting for you. So that's now neatly underneath, and what I can do is use my tracing wheel, and on this line of the other side of the button stand I can wheel that through. I could of course spend a lot of time measuring, but I am limited on time, and I've developed a way of pattern cutting that is straightforward, that is precise, and that is fairly simple, because I don't really do difficult things. It's just not really me. So now I can undo that, and then it will be very difficult for you to see these little dotted marks that have gone through, but I can see them, and I'm just going to join those dots as well. To make sure that I get this, what could potentially be not a flat shape, I'm just going to fold this back through. You can do this at the top or the bottom, but whenever there's a curved line or a line that looks like it's ever so slightly shaped, I fold that back on itself and then wheel that through, because we're going to add our seam allowance there. Now if I was just going to do a overlocked finish on this shirt, which I don't think I am, I may well be doing French seams because it's quite a delicate fabric, and where possible I do like to replicate techniques from the time. I'm basing this on 1930s style garments, and I can just see this going through like so. So there is a little bit of a ski slope there. And now I'm going to add, and I think I'm going to add 1.5. My seam allowances are always 1.5. Essentially, that's the majority of the pattern cutting for this. So what I'm going to do is add seam allowance around here. I've already added it there, as I've just shown you, and I've written on button stand, that's the button stand. This line is your centre front. So you're going to do your buttonholes on here, and you can mark on your buttonholes if you want. I, as a general rule, don't. I also need to write on the grain line, and I really love the pattern paper that comes either alphanumerical or these spots and crosses, because every spot and cross, every row of it, is actually showing you where your grain is, so it makes it really easy to cut out. So that's your grain line. I'm going to pop all my seam allowance around both the front and the back. Amazing, we don't need to do anything to the back particularly. And then we're going to have a look at the collar. Here's the bodice of the Pierrot blouse, and all the seam allowances are on there, and I'm going to cut out, and I just thought it would be worth just sharing a little tip about cutting out your patterns. So I was taught that what you do is you only ever use paper scissors for paper, And you use the table as an anchor. So if you can see here, I've got the scissors on the table, and you always, if you're right-handed, work with your pattern piece on your left and you go anti-clockwise, and if you're left-handed you do it the opposite way. So I move the paper really rather than the scissors, shall I say, and then fold the paper away as you're going, like so, and this should give you the most accurate cutting out you have ever done. So I'm going to just cut both of these out, and then it's collar time. To draft out this Pierrot collar, which I'm very excited about, we're essentially going to draft just a rectangle. And I don't know why I nearly always call this a triangle, but I am aware that it's not. So what I need to do is work out the measurements. So my front neck is 13 and the back is 10.5. So that is 23.5 centimetres. That's just the half. So we need to times that by 2. So that's 47 centimetres. To work out how long the rectangle needs to be, so this is the bit that goes on the neckline, and this is going to be the depth, and we're doing the neckline first. The more fabric you put in that, the more you gather, the more ruffly it will be. So this is down to your personal preference. When deciding on how much fabric this needs to be, the rule of thumb when creating gathers, ruffles, is that you times whatever the number by 1.5. I think that sometimes that can look a little bit stingy, and I do want this sort of flouncy effect. So I'm going to times this by 2, which gives me 94 centimetres. So that's going to be 94 centimetres. And then I want to work out the depth. I know that I don't want my collar to go over onto the shoulder, so I'm just going to measure the shoulder, and I think I'm going to do mine at, say, 10.5 centimetres to be very specific about it. 10.5 centimetres, and then I need to add all my seam allowance. So I'm going to go away and just draw this rectangle out, 94 centimetres, and the depth 10.5, and then add my seam allowances. I've drawn around my sleeve block, and the first thing that I'm going to do is decide how long I want my sleeve to be. I'm just sort of eyeballing this, and when it comes to these measurements, if I say that my sleeve is so and so long, that measurement may not really apply to you. So I want it more than 3/4, but not quite cuff length or wrist length. So I'm just gonna mark that off there. And because this is in pen and I don't want to get confused, I'm just going to scribble that no longer exists. And the next thing is to work out how wide I want this at that point on my arm. So I have measured that, and I know that I need that to be 13 centimetres. So either side of this centre line here, so this is the underarm point here, and this is the seam that will get sewn together, and this runs down the centre of your arm. So I know that I want this to be about 26 at the bottom there, and then I'm just going to join that to that underarm point. Now a check I always do, because I've got quite big elbows for various reasons, those check this measurement and just make sure that that measurement of 32, and I just pop that on there, even though I'm going to cut this out again in a minute. Just pop that on there. I'm going to measure my elbow just to make sure that fits. I'm going to show you the simplest way of working out a gathered sleeve head. There are lots of ways of doing this, it has to be said, but this is the simplest, most straightforward, especially when you are a beginner. So I'm going to find a point that lines up with this centre line here and the spots and crosses. I don't want to go below the pitch points. I don't want to interfere with anything there. So I'm just going to draw a line across here. And then I'm going to cut this out because we need to do what is called slashing and spreading to create the gathered sleeve head. I've drawn the centre line and then the elbow line on a fresh piece of spot and cross so that I can then just pin this onto here and it's nice and easy. And what I need to do to create this gather at the top of the sleeve head is to slash and spread. So I'm going to cut down to this point that I've created here, to this line, and then I'm going to cut out, slash as it's called, to that side and just leave it just on a tiny little hinge if possible. And then I'm going to do the same on that side, like so. Now I'm going to pin this in place. I like to use flathead stainless steel pins for pattern cutting, and I will demonstrate, probably quite poorly, why I like to use these momentarily. I'm going to pin here and around here. So the body's all pinned down, and now I'm going to spread this top bit. So we've cut that, and to create this gather in the sleeve head, all I'm going to do is push that up like so, creating this space and this space, which creates essentially this sort of going up and down again and gathering. What you need to make sure is that you keep these points in alignment, and the more you go, obviously the more gather, and the sort of higher the path, more extreme the path. I wouldn't in this instance go too far because you're going to create some sort of uncomfortable angles and it will make this difficult to sew. But I will tell you in a moment how far up I've moved this. So this measurement here, which is probably the most important one. So it doesn't matter so much what's going on here, it's really what you've done here that counts. So that measurement and the amount that I've gone up is about 3.8 centimetres. So just so that you know, 3.8 centimetres there. And then what I need to do is to draw around my sleeve, to trace around it, but also to rejoin this. And then draw around my sleeve, which I find very difficult to do with this pen. Before I unpin, take the pattern off, a couple of things that I just wanted to show you. So the reason that I use flathead pins is that actually I could lay my pattern master on these quite stably, and using the seam allowance gauge on my pattern master, I can actually just draw in my seam allowance really quickly. Now if I had used a pin with a bobble on the end, or a glass head, which are my preference for sewing, like so, you can see that actually you don't get the stability. So that's just a little tip from me to you in addition to this pattern cutting tutorial. And the other thing I want to do is just work out actually how far I've moved that out, and I'm going to do that by walking my tape measure around. So if ever you're measuring around a curve with a tape measure, you pop it on its side and you walk it around so you can navigate around all these curves. I've actually added in an additional 7 centimetres there, and I wanted to mark that and take a note of that, because basically that now needs to still gather into whatever the original measurement of that sleeve head was, because it's still got to fit into the arm side or the armhole of the blouse. So that one's going to be a little bit important in a minute. I'm going to finish doing all my seam allowance and take off the working pattern that I've been cutting and spreading and slashing, and then essentially we can review. One little addendum that I just wanted to add in, because at the bottom this is going in at this angle at this cuff, to work out how the seam allowance should be shaped here, what you need to do is fold that back in under itself, wheel through with your tracing wheel, and then redraw that shape on. And at the top I've worked out that this around here needs to gather into about 28 centimetres. So now I can cut that out, and we have all the pattern pieces for our Pierrot blouse, including the collar, which I've just cut on the fold because I didn't have quite enough paper. So that is just the rectangle that I worked out with the measurements, and then the 1.5 seam allowance all the way around. So I am going to crack on and get sewing my Pierrot collar, and I'm very excited to wear it. Thank you for taking the time to spend the time with me here today in my little cottage by the sea, and I really hope that you found something of interest here and maybe to inspire you today. I wish you well, my lovelies. Till next time.